Hi fam. Yeah, remember how I said I wanted to do more videos this year and then have completely failed to do that? Yeah. So this is my attempt to do something to catch up and to get back in the habit. I've got some other videos planned, but it's been a weird time. So let's do an end of summer, start of fall catch up. Yeah, let's hang out. So I'm just getting ready for the day for no very good reason because, oh my God, guys, joke is on me. I took the decision at the end of the summer to leave my job. I did not have anything else lined up. It was, as you can imagine, something going into a decision like that, there's a lot that goes into the decision like that, and that's not what I do or talk about here, so it's neither here nor there. But that means that for the whole month of September, I've been a tradwife. The universe, she laughs, she cackles, she looks down on me and says, "Oh, bitch, you thought you had it all figured out. Guess what? I've been a tradwife for the last month. I've been a stay-at-home dog mom for just over a month now. It's been fucking great. Love it. Don't want to do it for much longer, but I have been gardening. I have been knitting. I have been making sourdough regularly." Who is she? I thought today, just to get back into the swing of things, I would do books and beat my face. I have nowhere to go. I got no one to see, but I am trying to keep myself looking presentable, even though I'm spending all of my time at home. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk beauty and books. So buckle in. Love alliteration. Love it. So as you may know, I read a lot. I have always read a lot. I take in a huge amount of media genuinely for pleasure. I like commenting on it, yes, but I just absorb it. I listen to a large number of podcasts across a range of topics, news, pop culture, niche stuff, and I read incredibly widely. At any given time, I have one or two books on the go, usually at least one in audiobook format because, you know, the dog must be walked or chores must be done. But then I also read physical books. You can see one of our bookshelves behind me. And this is a hilarious fraction. When we went back to the States last summer, I think, we have like 20 boxes in storage at my lovely, lovely in-laws' house that's almost entirely books. Like, we've given our home goods away at this point. Like, our nieces and nephews really, really profited off of us when they started going to university or what have you, because we gave that away, but I am never giving my books away. And at some point, you know, we will become full-fledged adults and we will actually own a home. She cackled in incoming recession. And at that point, I'm going to have to probably build a ton of custom bookshelves just to fit all of the books that I have. But regardless, even in this limited capacity, we have a lot of books. I love them. And yet it takes a lot for me to own or buy one. They have to earn their place on my shelf. But I have two different library subscriptions, one in the States, one here in the UK. I have Kindle Unlimited, which I'm not hugely proud of because I don't love putting money in the coffers of Jeff Bezos. We might rant a little bit about that towards the end of the video because things are happening in the world of media, and I might genuinely have to change some of my reading choices and habits for reasons of morality. But at time of recording, I have Kindle Unlimited and two library subscriptions, and I almost always have my checkout and my hold list maxed out. I read a lot. I love it. So I thought I might try introducing a series where I just talk about that a bit more and share what I'm reading and ask you guys to do the same. So let's go into books that I read in September. Now, speaking of Jeff Bezos, I made the decision this year to stop using Goodreads as it's owned by Amazon. And this was was made possible because a really lovely friend of mine, who is the wife of one of Jeff's high school friends, and is a voracious reader herself and participates in all kinds of book club, book talk, book online culture in Utah, turned me on to StoryGraph as an alternative to Amazon. So if you're looking for an alternative to Amazon or Goodreads or what have you, Goodreads was always kind of a janky app. It wasn't always great. I wasn't sorry to get rid of it. And I am happier to support an independent business to track my reading. StoryGraph also does these really cool things where it will give you summaries, like monthly or yearly summaries, that you can measure in all kinds of ways, like what kinds of genres you are reading, how many pages. You can set challenges and track for yourself, the same as you do in Goodreads, and you can do multiple kinds of challenges. So if you want to read a number of books a year or a certain number of pages or any other metric, you can set that up for yourself. So yeah, I've been using it now since the start of the year. I really, really like it. It has its moments where like something weird will happen on the development end. But yeah, I'd rather spend my attention in something that's more independent. So yeah, can recommend it. And using that, we are going to be using my StoryGraph tracking to transparently divulge to you everything I've read this month. I made a video a while ago about enjoying genre media, specifically romance. And so, content warning, I guess, there's a lot of smut in my monthly confessional, my monthly literati confessional. And we're going to talk about that too. But lest you think it's all smut here, it's not. I read very widely on purpose. Like I said, I take in a huge amount of media. I try to read publications across the political spectrum to get my news, so I can check my own biases and I can see how the same content or the same incidents are being covered by whole swaths of the media. And I try to do the same in my reading. I read a ton of nonfiction across genres. And I think this month was a good month to start reporting back on this, because I think you can see that in the kinds of books that I read and the way I approach reading generally. So without further ado, let's talk about what I read this month. So first and foremost, history. First book I read this month was Joan of Arc by Helen Castor. Helen Castor is a British historian. She's done a lot on British TV programming, so if you watch any kind of historical documentaries, you've probably seen her at some point, and she's a prolific author. This book does what it says on the tin. It purports to be a historical telling of Joan of Arc. I struggled with that though, because Joan of Arc as the historical person doesn't even really appear till about a third of the way through the book. Helen Castor is a medievalist. Love that. And this book is really more about the early setup of the 100 Years' War, the context in which Joan of Arc's campaign happened, and very much less about the individual herself. So I found that a little bit weird, because I thought I was getting more of a biography, but it's not quite that, even though there are some historical details, because Joan's life is surprisingly well documented given the importance that she played in French history. But it's also been, because it's so well documented, it's also been pretty thoroughly covered historically. So there's not a lot new to say about her biographically. So I get the challenge of writing a book like this, and Helen Castor, decided to tell the history of the war that she fought in, but it wasn't what I thought it was going in. So good history, really enjoyed it, can recommend it if you're interested in that sort of thing. The next book I read was The Ideological Brain, The Radical Science of Flexible Thinking by Leor Zmigrod. I read a lot of books this month with people from unpronounceable names, but this was such a good nonfiction book and really, really timely. It is, again, exactly what it says on the tin. It talks about how the human brain creates and sustains ideology. And the thing that I really, really liked about this book is that it approaches ideology and ideological behavior in humans from a variety of disciplines. So there is neuroscience, but there's also philosophy, and there's also politics, and there's also history. And all of this is discussed and interchanged with in a way that is highly accessible to the reader. What I mean by that is this is a book that delves into what do we mean when we say the word ideology? What is the definition of ideology? How did we arrive at that? What are the historical and philosophical traditions that formed that way of thinking? Then, what does the science tell us about the human brain and how different kinds of people think? How they internalize different kinds of information? Why different groups of people and different individuals process that information in different ways? What can and cannot be measured given the science that we have at the moment, and how all of that manifests in the real world. I found this an incredibly timely read given the day and age in which we live. So again, this was a really, really accessible book that takes a lot of very big, very meaty topics, but distills it in a way that's really, really interesting and digestible to the reader. Next book I read was Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism by Yanis Varoufakis. I'm so sorry. This gentleman, I believe, is the former finance minister of Greece, and he oversaw a lot of their policy response to the Great Recession and to the austerity demands of the EU. He is fascinating. He uses some terms to describe himself that should be contradictory, like a Marxist libertarian. Like, it's fascinating. And to give him all due credit, he's very upfront about his ideologies and how that has informed his writing and has informed his worldview. He makes, in my opinion, an incredibly compelling case that current forms of technology at the scale with which they have been distributed across the world, particularly digital technology, and he doesn't start in the last 5, 10, 15 years. He goes back to like the 1960s and 70s and the start of the research and technologies and worldviews that formed the internet from a scientific perspective, and also reinforced our current version of kind of shareholder capitalism. He makes a really, really good case that technology, as we have developed it, the Silicon Valley model of it, has overtaken historical, traditional capitalism. I think he's right. I think, in the world of cadence, that a problem that we're seeing across the political spectrum, the financial spectrum, the technology spectrum, is we're dealing with things that have scaled far past the bounds of traditional democracy, i.e. Facebook has 4 billion people on it. That's half of the global population. That can't be contained by a single world government. In other words, Facebook is kind of coming up with its own laws and rules independent of governments, and therefore, in many ways, independent of the various financial models that are different across different countries, different economies, or different economic theories that may govern them. Interestingly, and I appreciate this, Varoufakis suggests a number of solutions to this to correct this tide. And I don't agree with them, but I appreciate that he is a writer and he is a theorist who is able to make a case and then set out some suggestions. Golly, it's a meaty book. I really, really recommend it. If you want to understand a coherent theory of why technology and capitalism are in the state that they are, why things like the AI hype might be turning into a bubble, might be, it's a separate rant, how specific technologies have come to dominate, I think at time of recording, like AI investment writ large is the equivalent of about 7% of US GDP. That's huge. That is an outsized influence. And why this is turning whole populations into something that is closer to digital serfdom than it is to digital citizenship, it's well worth your time. You might not agree with his take, you might not agree with his solutions like I didn't, but it's an important idea, I think, to actually sit with and understand. My next book was Miracles and Wonders, The Historical Mystery of Jesus by Elaine Pagels. Elaine Pagels is a famous religious historian, a historian specifically of early Christianity. And I've read other stuff by her in the past. This was a fantastic book about the origins of and the historical context of the first century of Christianity. Why did I want to read this now? Well, weirdly, in my nonfiction reading life, I find that I inadvertently stumble into themes. Sometimes I pick a theme that I want to read on for a long period of time, and I will intentionally seek out multiple books on the same topic to get a number of points of view because I want to learn more and I want to inform my own opinion. And sometimes things are just floating in the zeitgeist. And Christianity for me is in the zeitgeist right now for a number of reasons. Most notably, Christian nationalism in the US discourse, and also how Christian nationalist pageantry or aesthetics is used in other nationalist agendas. Again, possibly a separate video, a separate rant, but I've ranted quite a bit on my terrible and unwatchable Instagram stories about how American Christianity is weird in a way that I don't think most Americans genuinely appreciate. We're a big country. We have our own takes and our own historical development of whole strains of Christianity that if you've only been born and raised and spent the majority of your time in the United States, I don't think you appreciate how uniquely American it is. I was raised in Mormonism, which is a foundationally American sect. But okay. Last week, rapture talk happened. Here's a bit of a time capsule moment, but the idea of the rapture went viral on TikTok because I think some South African preacher predicted that September 23rd or something was going to be the rapture. Rapture ideology is huge in American Christianity. It's huge, particularly in American evangelicalism. But the concept of the rapture did not exist in the earliest phases of Christianity. It's not a biblical interpretation. It is its own thing that has evolved over time. And I think to genuinely understand things like Christian nationalism, to understand whole swaths of American culture and politics, you have to understand Christianity. You have to understand American Christianity and its own pockets of weirdness. And also, in order to intelligently and respectfully weigh and measure and engage with the claims of some of these people, you have to know the actual history. So if you are at all interested in a not faith promoting and not faith diminishing historical view of how various aspects of the Gospels came to be, about the wider context of the Romano-Judeo conflicts in which the historical Jesus of Nazareth was born and operated, and how his movement and other movements like his, which were operating at the same time in the same areas, were interacting and engaging with power, and how movements then sustain themselves after the loss of a leader, or even if you're just at all interested in how mythology, in a very non-pejorative way, and how a mythology grows and what it takes to perpetuate itself against risk, or what it takes to codify itself into a canon, into a theology, this is a fantastic book. Strongly, strongly recommend. Remember how I said I read a lot on themes? I didn't mean to do this, but one of the themes that I've been reading up a lot this year is capitalism. I need bisexual lighting to come out whenever I say that. But one of the more interesting reads that I've engaged with in the history of how American shareholder techno-fueled capitalism has come about in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st. I read Palo, Alto, A History of California Capitalism and the World by Malcom Harris. And this book is fascinating. The premise is that it takes the actual geographical area of Palo Alto, California, and through the history of its colonization, through the history of its business development, through the history of the specific interest groups that have migrated to the area, invested in the area, built up the area, developed it, and then spread its work all over the world, that understanding the history of this unique geographical area and the forces that have converged around it can, in microcosm, teach you the history of Western capitalism and how it has affected almost every area of our lives. This concept doesn't sound like it should work. It's brilliant. Golly, one of the things that I've unintentionally learned this year through my reading is just how much of 20th century history, from progressive era to two world wars to the Depression to the backlash against colonization and the breakdown of empires to everything now, a lot of this stuff is fundamentally rooted in ideas of supremacy and eugenics in a way that's deeply uncomfortable to learn. What I mean by that, in the case of this book, is I had no idea that Stanford, as a research area, and including the family, the Stanford family, that invested so heavily in this area, did so foundationally in their institutes or their projects based on eugenics. In one case, members of the Stanford family, I believe, bred racehorses. And they took the racehorse theories that they had picked up from the Darwinism that sprang up in the latter half of the 19th century and informed the colonization of the American West. They took the lessons of Darwinism and applied it, of course, into social Darwinism. And then they invested money and research into specifically looking into eugenics and how to make better men and to make technologies that would build better men or breed better men or keep lesser men from breeding. And this has implications all over the world. Herbert Hoover who is always an American president that I thought, bore the brunt of the Depression, but was, I thought, somewhat mischaracterized because I was familiar with his earlier work globally in fighting the Holodomor, the Soviet based famine of Eastern Europe. He was really, really involved with these kind of humanitarian works across the world. And I don't think that his reputation about the Depression is entirely deserved. And then it turns out he was heavily involved with the Stanford family and a lot of their endeavors and their businesses. And he came out of this world specifically funded to study and apply the lessons of eugenics and social Darwinism. And I'm like, okay, we'll just slot that layer into everything. This sounds like a bit of a tangent, but again, this might be another video in the future, just learning how much ideas of supremacy, the idea that some people are inherently better than others, and should therefore be in command of the world, is, I think, the defining trait of the 20th century. And it stems entirely out of the Darwinism of the 19th century, which is weird because Darwin didn't necessarily think that way. And his ideas were picked up and spread by people like Malthus or other thinkers who wanted to apply the scientific advancements and insights of Darwin to their own political and moral and religious projects. And I think that's still happening today. And this book was a fascinating microcosm view of how those kinds of ideologies and that transition period from the end of the 19th century into the early 20th have informed how business and politics in the United States developed over the 20th century. And I now feel like I have a much better understanding of the rising tide of nationalism that we're confronting now in the 21st century, where again, racism, misogyny, patriarchy, a lot of hierarchical ways of thinking are on the march and are on the move again, because they are foundationally based in the idea that some people deserve to rule over others. We're not as far away from it as we think. My favorite book this month is very much an addendum to the Palo Alto book. It's called More Everything Forever: AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity by Adam Becker. Read this book. Find it. Get it on audiobook. Download it. I don't care. This was a fantastic book to read because, once again, I didn't intend this. I picked it up because, I was trying to read up more on AI, its development, the business models behind it, because I have some very critical views of this, so I try to make sure that I'm checking myself. But once again, reading this book, it is about AI as the current burst of technological and industry pursuits, but it's also about how it's just the latest in a long-term list of these kind of movements of supposed technological advancements, which are controlled, steered, and nominally headed by a group of people, the Elon Musks, the Peter Thiels, the Sam Altmans, the whomever, who see themselves as Ubermenches. They see themselves as somehow better, different, more deserving than other people. And while they might on paper have ambitions to be benevolent dictators, that main character syndrome problem of techno-capitalism has second and third order consequences for the development of business and technology. Adam Becker, I think, correctly spells out that a bunch of techno-billionaires think that they should be in charge of the development of humanity. They think that they should oversee the colonization of other worlds. They think that they should oversee the efficiencies of our governments. They think that they are better than other people and therefore more capable and more deserving and more entitled to control the fates of large numbers of people. They think the only good future is one powered by technologies that they control and that they are in charge of. He writes about these trends of largely obsessive men who claim their ideas are based on science, but a cursory scratching of the surface tends to reveal that they're often based on notions gleaned from science fiction from the middle of the last century, so nearly a century out of date now, that they have a jumbled mix of a fictional-based idea of futurism, but one that is also based in some really key and important ways on pseudoscience, which includes things like supremacy science, race science, gender science, blah, 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 blah. Again, like, scratch the surface, and things like eugenics, the idea that some people are better than others, is just cropping up everywhere. And I didn't expect it to crop up in this book in this way as explicitly as it did. This book also really does a good job of laying out the problem of how small groups of wealthy or powerful people are avoiding the problems of now by promising solutions in the future. A good example of this is AI will solve climate change. Number one, solve climate change. What does that mean? They couldn't tell you if you questioned them, but they don't know what that solution will be. They have no idea when it will come about, but by golly, we should be spending trillions and trillions of dollars in the here and now funding infrastructure build or political campaigns, which will continue to deplete the resources we have now on a very, very vague and amorphous idea that somehow in the future the problem will solve itself. I find this morally repugnant. But this book is a really good example of how futurism can be propped up by very little common sense and very, very bad science, and how an aspirational PR comm story can really, really obscure the practical realities of here and now. Probably my favorite book of the year so far also touches on this theme. It's Empire of AI by Karen Howe. I'll probably do some best books of 2025 roundup. But it goes into some of the same principles. The idea of how much of Silicon Valley, and therefore how much the American business ecosystem, again, to the tune of something like 7% of GDP, is all based on storytelling and myth making. And, you know, money is fictional. Money is mutually agreed fiction, as I like to say. But if money is mutually agreed fiction and a huge amount of business is based in mythology, we need to understand where those mythologies came from, what those mythologies claim, what they're based on. And a lot of the ideas about colonizing space are not based in science. There's a lot of practical problems that we haven't solved yet. So whenever Elon Musk talks about colonizing Mars, which I think we were supposed to do 5 years ago, I don't know, there's a lot of practical problems about how we get enough water and fuel and food to that area, and then interrogating what it would mean. If we do have a permanent colony on Mars, for instance, Mars can't grow anything. So what we're actually doing, in theory, is creating a dependent permacolony. And again, Elon Musk wants to be the man who controls that pipeline of goods. And when you really think about it, that means that he could, at a whim, flip a switch and decide not to send the water shipment this month because they've pissed him off. I'm being a bit facetious here, but what you're actually talking about, again, is closer to a degree of lordship and feudalism. Peter Thiel is very much on the record of wanting to create functional city-states of libertarianism, which he doesn't necessarily use this language, but when you interrogate it and you look at it, Tizzy, shut up. I'm talking about our arch nemesis. But when you actually look at it, means that he wants to create vassalage for lots of people. You know, this is such an important book. I think my favorite story that he tells in the whole narrative is towards the end. And Becker describes, I think, a dinner party, I think, that he went to, which had a bunch of very, very wealthy VC type people who were all involved with AI in some way. And he talked about how everyone kind of went around the table and threw out their estimate of when AI was going to happen, or AGI. You know, in other words, when this technology would become functionally human equivalent in its competency, in its ability to act, in its ability to replicate economically valuable work the way that a person could. And around the table, everyone was just throwing, 3 years, 5 years, you know, some near future kind of things. And Becker himself, who is informed on the subject, had a much more nuanced take. And he was prepared to be kind of the beggar at the feast going, I think we're like 300 to 500 years away from it, actually, because he understands a lot of the practical scientific breakthroughs we haven't achieved yet. But before he spoke up, someone else did. And, you know, that story alone is really well worth reading. And then Becker also talks about how another person came up to him after the dinner party. I believe it was the only woman in the room, and confided to him how she too didn't think that we were talking about 3 or 5 years. But she felt so uncomfortable saying that she just went along with everybody else around the table. And Becker uses that as a really good example of how mutually agreed fiction can turn into hype cycles, can turn into a bunch of people who are not actually scientists, who are not actually operating in realms of good current science as opposed to science fiction from a century ago. People who don't know what they're talking about, but are still responsible for moving amounts of money on par with nation states. And they're all doing it in a speculative way for some far off thing instead of actually confronting the problems we're dealing with now. This is a good book. You should read it. Continuing my joyride, another book that I read and enjoyed this month, Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America by Heather Cox Richardson. If you're at all politically minded, you've probably come across her content. She is a historian. She's an incredibly thoughtful commentator about the current moment of American history, and she's really, really good at contextualizing it. This book tells the story of 20th century America and how 2025 America is, in her telling, the product of a response to effectively the New Deal. How Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his brand of progressive politics, whether or not you agreed with all aspects of them, and I don't think even she agrees with all aspects of them, but how that served as a catalyst movement for whole movements of cultural, social, and economic conservatism to congeal into the Republican Party, and how that Republican Party has decided to try and wield power ever since. I think she makes a really, really strong case for this perspective. And she... Tizzy, hush. She does a really good job of contextualizing, you know, how the American Civil War led to this, how the progressive movement led to this, how Reconstruction, how the end of the Industrial Revolution all fed into this. But the case that she makes specifically has to do with the 20th century and how out of that sprang everything from the Ku Klux Klan, you know, as a resurgent political force, to the John Birch Society, to Newt Gingrich, to the backlash against Obama, all the way up to the Trump era. Heather Cox Richardson has a really optimistic view of American history overall, but she also has a very clear-eyed view of it. So, yeah, if you have at all engaged with her content, this book is definitely worth reading. It's short, it's like 280 something pages. But she makes a good case, and one that I think helps contextualize and understand the current state of American conservatism, what it is, what it isn't, what it claims to be, what it actually is, not all of which are aligned. My love. Anthony Horowitz's Susan Ryland series, Murder Mysteries, of course. I love Anthony Horowitz. He does a lot of amazing mystery series. I really like the Susan Ryland books, though. The premise is that Susan Ryland, the main character, is a fiction editor, and she had a long-standing client who himself was a mystery writer. In the first book in the series, he passed away, and his death, of course, sets off the chain of events that she has to unravel. And in each subsequent book, this is the third in the series, this dead author's influence still lingers over her life and makes her life hard in really, really frustrating ways. Horowitz is a fantastic writer. He does great characters. And what I really like about the Susan Ryland series is that he does books within books, mysteries within mysteries. There's always the Susan Ryland main character mystery, but it's always tied to the manuscript of the fictional author. So you get two mysteries for the price of one in all of his writing. And I really enjoy it. My father-in-law and I bond over mystery books. And so, we love it. We love mystery series. So we're constantly recommending them to one another, and I've recommended a lot of Horowitz books to him. Again, I didn't necessarily pick all of this reading to be thematic in the way that it was, but my next book was When the Moon Turns to Blood, Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, and a Story of Murder, Wild Faith, and End Times by Leah Sotil. This is a fascinating book because it deals with a murder case that takes place in the context of, number one, fringe Mormonism, and by extension, other fringe aspects, again, of American Christianity, most of which have a very, very strong, compelling tie to end times narratives. I mentioned before American Christianity is wild, and I don't think enough Americans appreciate that. I'm going to actually change the lighting here. Hold on. Is that better? That feels better. I mentioned before that American Christianity is fucking wild. In a way that I don't think many Americans and American Christians always necessarily appreciate. But so many different variations of American Christianity, and I include Mormonism in that milieu, along with many other fringe groups, breakaways, just the more mainstream lines, particularly of American Protestantism, or the weird ones that we've cooked up for ourselves, are all fundamentally based on a narrative of the end of the world. And I think this is true foundationally in American history. Like, in American history, we have two joint colonization and settlement myths. One is Jamestown, which is the, Virginia Company capitalism founding myth, and the other one is Plymouth, the religious freedom founding myth. But the truth of the matter is that the Puritans that settled in Plymouth weren't so much escaping religious persecution as they were looking for a place to practice their own extremist version of Christianity. And they were an end times group. We don't think of them that way. We don't tell the story of the first Thanksgiving in that way, but they were. And that mentality that helped to settle New England and then set off multiple generations of subsequent splinter groups and breakaway groups and great awakenings, of which my own childhood faith tradition, Mormonism, sprang out of one of them, is an underappreciated aspect of American culture, I think. End times beliefs inform huge swaths of the American experience. There is an aspect of an end times ideology that informs our approach to things like international policy with the nation of Israel. Highly relevant right now. And that's because there's a group of people that believes in certain biblical prophecies that have to occur in specific ways, yada, yada, yada. And that informs whole aspects of, as I said, international policy. The idea that the world is about to end has always been present in Christianity, but I think is more present in American versions of Christianity than it is in other parts of the world. And this book is, again, tells a single story of a fringe of a fringe of a fringe group and what happens when religious extremism tips over into personal violence. The author, I think, does a really, really good and fair job of differentiating this extremist fringe from mainstream Mormonism, but also explaining how aspects of mainstream Mormonism can be radicalized. And she also explains how this doesn't just happen in Mormonism. David Koresh was part of a sect that was a devolution of Seventh-day Adventism. All American Christianity, all religions have the capacity for extremism within them. And this book is the story of how a few people self-radicalized in ways that ended up causing huge amount of harm and damage and ultimately ended in murder. As I'm recording this, we're once again dealing with a spate of violence in the United States. And over the weekend, someone drove a truck into a Mormon church in Michigan and also set it on fire. And this follows a shooting, I believe, at a Catholic school for children and other religious institutions. Religious extremism is something that needs to be understood in order to properly understand our current political moment. The Charlie Kirk shooting, the attack on the LDS church in Michigan, the attack on the Catholic school of a couple of weeks ago. Not all extremism is religious in nature, but it is almost always ideological in nature. And therefore, understanding how religion and how religious ideology works, how processes of radicalization can work, and how these things can mutually reinforce one another is a very timely thing to be thinking about right now. So even though this is a particularly dark story based on the murder of 2 children, I think that this book is timely in understanding how people self-radicalize using religious beliefs as a jumping off point to do really horrible things. Next up on our tour of atrocities, the next book I read was America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States by Erica Lee. Racism, eugenics, ideologies of hierarchy and power and supremacy. Holy shit. It's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere, and it's foundational in our history, and we need to understand it better. This book was not an easy thing to read. It was pretty dark, and it tells a lot of stories that people will be familiar with, from Indian removal acts to the internment of Japanese American citizens during World War II. But it goes deeper than that. It goes into how different migration movements across all of our history, like from before America was its own nation state, have been viewed, handled, interrogated, and contended with. We're talking Benjamin Franklin being freaked out about bunches of Germans migrating to the United States. We're talking about different waves of Jewish immigration. We're talking about how, the Irish were originally viewed as less than human, i.e. like a subcategory of human often on par with African Americans in how they were viewed and portrayed in pop culture and media, from their physiography to assumptions about their character or their capabilities. Of course, we're talking about the experience of African Americans. We're talking about different waves of Asian immigration over time and how, you know, we had the Chinese Exclusion Acts, how that has flipped on its head over time for a while for Asians becoming the good immigrants, how whiteness has informed views of Hispanic migration. It's fucking everywhere in our history, and it's so much more complicated than current headlines go into. You know a bunch of this history, and I guarantee you, you don't know most of what's in this book. This was a fantastic read. You should go back to, as I said before, America was a nation state, and understand how the concept of otherness, how the concept of strangers, you know, xenophobia, literally fear of the other, has informed how we established our nation state, how we expanded it, who got to be involved, who was purposefully excluded, and how. And again, the basis on which that exclusion took place, normally on notions of some kind of supremacy, that some people were genetically, socially, whatever, morally, inherently better than others. This is a really timely book again. Definitely recommend. Let's see, what else did I read? I read Ursula K. Le Guin's The Language of the Night, Essays on Fantasy and Science Fiction. Ursula K. Le Guin, iconic science fiction author, speculative fiction author. This is a collection of her own writings, from intros to her own books, speeches that she gave, essays that she produced about the concept of science fiction, what it means as a genre, how her own thinking about her writing and her own genre evolved over her decades of producing. She goes into how the genre was established, you know, a bunch of people writing for one another in magazines to being an actual publishing category and what those changes meant. She talks about how she does and does not think of her own writing in relation to external publishing categories. She interrogates her own work and says where she thinks that her assumptions were wrong or bad, or how she couldn't have written that piece of work at a different stage of her life because of how her own thinking and knowledge evolved. And she does all of this without being the least bit arrogant or patronizing or insufferable. If you're at all interested in the process of writing, if you're at all interested in speculative fiction, if you're at all interested in science fiction history as a genre, which again, given some of my other recommendations, understanding how science fiction came to be and how it influences other people is a really important thing to understand right now. This is worth your time. My last nonfiction book for this month was The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History by Ned Blackhawk. This is a retelling of American history, but instead of centering the colonial experience, it centers the indigenous experience, what it was like for tribes, for indigenous nations, for groups who existed and were acknowledged to have existed long before America was a nation state or was a concept, and how they have experienced American history. It starts from the Columbian Exchange and how that famously introduced a bunch of diseases into the Americas, which decimated the population and therefore made colonization in North America by Europeans even possible. Blackhawk explains how, again, in the Puritan settlement story, something that is underappreciated is that the Puritans didn't rock up onto virgin land. They rocked up into an area that had been cultivated and hunted and harvested and managed by indigenous communities for thousands of years. And the Puritans were able to take advantage of some of that local infrastructure when it came to producing food, when it came to producing industry. famously, you know, some of the earliest native peoples who engaged with settlers to the America had already themselves crossed the Atlantic multiple times. They were familiar with Europeans from centuries of interactions, even though they were not sustained until, you know, the 17th century. It talks about how for huge aspects of American colonial history, Native Americans lived in community with white settlers, what that looked like, what the tensions were. It talked about how different indigenous nations formed treaties with European powers, how they looked different in the Spanish, French, and English settlement areas. And then, of course, it goes into how manifest destiny, westward expansion, etc., you know, the really horrible history of colonization in America affected indigenous communities. But again, it does so centering the indigenous experience and telling the story from that perspective, what it was like economically, how different tribes responded in different ways, how different groups came together to advocate for or seize political power, how they counteracted these movements. Really, really, really fascinating. Again, a lot of history that you will know, but not from this perspective and not through this lens. So highly recommended. That was all of my respectable reading. What else did I read this month? A lot of smut. I read the latest in Lissa Lemaire's Sinbin stories called In the Net. I read Sonia Graves' Medvedev Bratva series. There's 3 books in that. The latest, Tessa Bailey. I think her nickname is like the Michelangelo of Dirty Talk. So if you need a recommendation from me, can recommend. Her latest in her Big Shot series, Picture Perfect. I continued with Hannah Gray's New England Bay Sharks series with her 5th in that, which was called Wake Me Up. Jerry Anthony's Ashford Fall series, number 2, Don't Make Me Beg. Taylor Aston White's Blood and Thorns, which is a dark mafia kind of romance, but is a retelling of the Beauty and the Beast trope, which, you know, famous in Smut. Then I got through all of Sarah Smith's Denver Basher series, which is, I think, 5 books thus far. What else? I dipped my toes back into Natasha Madison's hockey series with Only for Tonight, which is, I think, is a second generation from another series that she did years ago. Didn't love it as much as her original series, but, you know, it's fun smut. On the other hand, continued with Kate Canterbury's, who's one of my favorite romance authors, series, with her standalone novel, Missing in Action, which is a male-male romance novel, which was fantastic. I love Kate Canterbury. Her series on the Walsh siblings is one of my favorite romance series of all time. Highly, highly recommended if you've not read it. This is kind of part of that, but is more of a spin-off from that series. So no surprise that I liked it as much as I did. And that's what I read this month. It was great. Come find me on StoryGraph and tell me what you've read. Definitely tell me about your genre reading. I'm always very interested. We are a smut positive channel here, but also, did you find yourself reading topically, whether on purpose or on accident, as I did? I'm definitely interested. If you've read any other books that kind of speak to the topics that I talked about in this ramble, send them my way. I want to know. And yeah, it's good to be filming again, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.